Notre Dame fans, welcome back to another edition of the Irish Breakdown Podcast. That is Sean Davis. I'm Brian Driscoll, and we're ready to talk about Notre Dame and BYU, Sean. It is officially game week. We got the recruiting stuff out of the way yesterday. You guys talked about just another weekend of wild college football games, more firings, and there will be more.
Yeah.
Your alma mater kind of put the final nail in the coffin for Paul Christ this past weekend, and it not just was it a bad loss to Illinois, but it was Brett Bielema as the guy on the other sideline certainly did him in. But the focus today is going to be on Notre Dame and BYU, and what we're going to talk about today, Sean. We're going to kind of diverge a little bit from our normal routine on Tuesday, which is kind of an introduction to the other team. We're going to talk about BYU a little bit. But what we're going to begin with is kind of talking about what this game means for Notre Dame, because I think this is a huge game for Notre Dame in a lot of different ways, Sean. Yeah. And obviously there's a ton at stake, big picture, long-term, short-term, all of it. And that's really what the focus of today is going to be, because you come out of the break riding a lot of momentum. You go into the second half of the season, the way the schedule shapes up, if Notre Dame can get a W in this game, it could really potentially, and we'll get into specifics, but it could really potentially be a launching point for this football team under Marcus Freeman in year one.
You know what? When you say that, it's something that I had a conversation with my dad, and he reminded me of some things. And Notre Dame is playing the long game here, right? Mm-hmm. Like, why else would you hire a first-time head coach with no experience coming into a situation if you didn't expect that there will be some growing pains? Like, and if you didn't expect growing pains from the head coach or coaching staff, then you were kind of like not being realistic about, what you were doing. And when Jack Swarbrick made the hire, I don't know if the schedule, I'm glad the schedule plays out the way it does, because regardless of whether or not they lose to Marshall, even if they had beaten Marshall, they wouldn't have been playing well.
Right.
Beating Marshall.
Right.
And we all know what the month of November means in a lot of different areas from a scheduling standpoint with the two teams they have to face in that month. October really sets up either way. If they were 3-1 right now, unfortunately they're 2-2. October was going to be the month that allowed them to develop into the team they needed to be come November. Like, the task still remains the same, even though they're 2-2. So this is what lies ahead of them starting out in the desert on Saturday night with BYU. Once again, it's a challenge, but it's a challenge for Notre Dame to continue the climb to become the team they need to be by the time November comes around. And that was going to be the case regardless of how September played out. And this schedule really sets up really nice, in my opinion, with the foes they have in front of them. It's like, okay, Marcus Freeman talked about the strengths and weaknesses of his team yesterday. The teams that they're facing really play well into their strengths and allows them to be able to work on their weaknesses as they go through October. So that's something to really watch out for.
It's interesting. Marcus Freeman talked about this a little bit in his press conference yesterday, Sean, where he talked about, I'm trying to remember exactly how he said it, but he kind of talked about, like, just winning doesn't necessarily mean you're playing well. Yeah. And he kind of alluded to the fact that sometimes winning can mask bigger problems. I think that to your point, that the losses, although not acceptable, and I'm not okay with them, and there's no spin to that. There's no, hey, but this is good that you lost to Marshall. There's none of that. Having said that, it does expose you and expose your warts much more so than an ugly win. Let's say Tyler Buckner hits, Braden Lindsey on that go route, late in the fourth quarter when they're up 15-12. Let's say he bangs that post route at the end of the first half and he hits it, and they end up going on to win an ugly game. Does this team kind of then go lose to Cal next week because they didn't necessarily feel the need to fix some of the things that needed to get fixed? Do they lose to North Carolina instead of Cal or Marshall because they didn't fix the things that needed to get fixed? So it's not an acceptable loss, but the reaction to it has been so far positive.
Yeah.
And I think that you have to continue that positivity because we still don't know who this football team is, Sean.
No.
Are they the football team that looked great for 3 quarters against North Carolina and for 2.5 quarters against Cal, or the team that looked bad for 4 quarters against Marshall and collapsed in the last quarter and a half against Ohio State? There's a lot of conflicting, evidence of this team. And I think and Coach Freeman responded to a question that I asked yesterday about that. I asked, look, the bye week, does it give you more opportunity for self-scouting than a normal week where, kind of by Sunday night, the thing I've said is by Sunday night, you're moving on to your next opponent. You sometimes have less than 24 hours to really absorb what just happened before you're ready to game plan. So it's hard to kind of do the deep dive into self-scouting. And he said, yeah, we do that, but we've only got 4 games, right? And they're having the same conflicting conversation we have. Who are we? Are we the team that looked like the way we did? I mean, for about 5.5 quarters against Cal, really the end of the first half against Cal, you started to see Notre Dame kind of wake up a little bit.
Yeah.
And then really the second half against Cal, the first 3 quarters of North Carolina, that's the team we thought we were going to see this year, right? Like that's the team that we thought could beat Ohio State, could beat Clemson and USC. And then, of course, the fourth quarter shows that they're not there yet, right? And so his point was there's still a lot we have to learn about this football team. And so I think this game kind of presents a sort of a next step towards, us learning a little something about this football team. It presents them with so many different opportunities, Sean, to get a big win, to learn about themselves, and to play a team that I think challenges them in some ways that they need to be challenged to really learn about themselves. And so when we first talk about what's at stake, I think the biggest thing for me, Sean, is momentum, right? This is the first thing that's at stake in this game. There's a lot of momentum. You've won 2 games in a row. You're now playing the best team you faced since Ohio State from a ranking standpoint. Can you go out there and beat this team and do it in a way where you start to look like the team you're supposed to be? I think that matters. It's not just about winning, right? Because what you and I are talking about is a dual reality. It's the momentum that is sort of the micro. It's what's going to help you then go beat Stanford and then UNLV and then Syracuse and all that. And then there's the macro, which involves your perception from a recruiting standpoint, from a transfer portal standpoint, from an assistant coach standpoint, from a media standpoint, from a Notre Dame fan standpoint. It's not just about beating BYU 24-21. It's about also showing yourself to be the team you're supposed to be, which would incorporate a convincing win over BYU. At this point, I'm just happy with a win. But if we're really talking about building momentum, it needs to be, why can't you look like Oregon looked when they smacked BYU, right? Or are you closer to Baylor than you are to Oregon? So all those things matter, Sean, and that's the opportunity. Is Notre Dame winning is a positive. It builds the momentum. But Notre Dame needs to start looking like the team they're supposed to be, which isn't just beating BYU. It's clearly being the better team. Now, is that a 10-point win? Is that a 20-point win? That can vary, but it needs to be that game where at the end of the game, you're like, yeah, they were clearly the better team than that team, and they handled their business. I think that's the first thing at stake in this game, Sean, is the momentum and the perception of this football team.
And you talk about matchups because you just pointed out, what people like to do. Okay, Utah State was able to do this, so Notre Dame should be able to do this. Oregon was able to dominate, so Notre Dame should be able to dominate. And we all know that anytime you walk on the field, anything can happen. Like we're talking about teenagers. You don't know who's going to show up, who's not going to show up. And BYU does have a formidable offense with a really good quarterback that is going to go up against this Notre Dame defense. But one thing I will say is that the Baylor offense is still questionable.
Yes.
You watch them against Oklahoma State. You saw what Oregon was able to do, and you saw what Utah State was able to do. And I'm sure you guys would get into this. BYU struggles mightily to set the edge. You talk about that all the time. They are not good at setting the edge in the run game. If you run straight at them, they're pretty good. If you run straight at them, they're a little bit better. But when you attack the edges, they, for some reason, have consistently shown that they're not able to set the edge with their defense. And maybe that's a scheme standpoint. Maybe they're playing to their strengths and they know we can't do that. But when you don't set the edge and you play your defensive backs off, you're basically giving 5 yards, to any smart offensive coordinator will take it and work the way down the field. And I'll say this as well. Baylor and Utah State both had opportunities to score that they didn't take advantage of. So this is going to be about Notre Dame, in my opinion, not squandering opportunities, because they're going to have opportunities. Will they be able to take advantage of those the same way they did against North Carolina?
Sean, you talked about the setting the edge part, right? And we'll dive into the matchups later this week. But to your point, when did Utah State get stopped against BYU? On those 3rd and 4th and shorts where they tried to run right up the middle and right downhill at them, right? And then you watch Oregon, and Oregon was able to have a little mix of the both. So, this is a team that is certainly beatable, but it's also a team that can beat you. I mean, Notre Dame lost to Marshall. So Notre Dame lost to Marshall not that long ago. Then clearly they can lose to BYU. So I think this is going to be a test of just how far this team has come or not. And I think that's going to be an important thing because, as we said, the perception of this football team is very, very important. I mean, when you look at the schedule coming up, Sean, and this is a big part of it too, you get BYU this week. Then the next week you're home against Stanford. And then the next week after that, you're home against UNLV. Who would have thought before the season that we'd be more concerned about the UNLV game than the Stanford game? I mean, and honestly, at this point in time, that's accurate. UNLV's 4-1, right? I mean, they beat North Texas by 31, Utah State by 10, very similar to the margin of victory at Utah State, very similar to the margin of victory that BYU had over Utah State. And then I don't know if you watching the New Mexico game they had this weekend, but they were down at halftime and came back and won by 11. Like, they're doing a really nice job there. I think Marcus Arroyo is their coach, right? I think he was at Oregon for a while. Doing a great job at UNLV. And so I'm more concerned about that game than Stanford at this point in time. But the point is, you've got a chance to go on a run here where by the time you go to, you go back on the road after this game, you're going to be playing Syracuse. You're going to be a top 25 team. If you win these next 3, you're going to be a top 25 team, especially the way that teams are dropping like flies every week. Those are like 7 or 8 new teams in the top 25 this week. That's going to keep happening. There's even more top 25 matchups this week than there were last week of teams that are both ranked in the top 25, Sean. So when you look at it, this is an opportunity for Notre Dame to really change the perception of who they are. And we talked about this in a recent show, Sean, and this factors into what you and I are discussing today. I compare it to the Notre Dame 2015 team to the USC 2016 team. Both ended the season, or excuse me, the Notre Dame 2017 team, excuse me. You could make the same case for the 2015 team, but the 2017 team finished the year 9-3, ranked, right outside the top 10. The 2016 USC team finished the regular season 9-3, but that was considered a red hot team that could play with anybody. What was the difference? USC got hot late. They had their bad losses in September. They were 1-3 at one point in time. Notre Dame was hot early. They lost to Georgia in week 2 and then just steamrolled people and then faded in November. So 2 teams with identical records, similar stats, similar margin of victory, similarly bad losses, right? Notre Dame lost by 33 to Miami. USC lost by over 40 to Alabama, had a double-digit loss to Stanford, similar to Notre Dame's loss to Stanford at the end of the year in 2017. But the perception of USC was that team could have played with anybody because they got hot late. Same thing for Notre Dame is if you're going to go 10-2, you want to have a 10-2 where you lose 2 games early as opposed to Clemson and USC down the stretch. Now, 10-2 is still ahead of us, right? They've got to prove they can beat BYU first. But the point is, this is what's at stake against BYU, is to go on this run where you gain some momentum, because I still think this team as a whole still needs more confidence. They need to play with more confidence. And there's some players and some units that are starting to show that. There's others that still aren't there yet. The linebacking core was better. They still don't play with a great deal of confidence. I think there are some guys in the secondary that didn't show me the confidence they should against North Carolina. I think the receivers are still not playing with a great deal of confidence. So there's parts of this team that still aren't playing with a great deal of confidence. And for Drew Pine, for example, he also is somebody that needs to build on the game he had against North Carolina. So I think another big thing that's at stake here, Sean, is confidence. I think if this team can build confidence, then they're going to be the team we thought they were going to be. That team is not gone. The team we thought they could be at the beginning of the year is not gone. Notre Dame is 2-2. They beat BYU. Cam Hart's not playing all that well. Maris Luafau's not playing all that well. Brandon Josephs have been solid, but not great since the opener. Your offensive line is starting to play well. Your receiving core has done almost nothing this year of note. And your running backs are just now really starting to pick it up. There's a lot more room for improvement for this football team, but now you got to show it. So that's the other thing, too, is I think that's a stake here, Sean, is this team needs another injection of confidence on top of what they had coming into the break. If you go into the break with that momentum, beating a now 4-1 North Carolina team, and who just smashed North Virginia Tech the week after they lost to Notre Dame, and then you go on a neutral field closer to BYU than South Bend, Indiana, and you beat a number 16 team in the country, all of a sudden this team gets a huge confidence boost going into the Stanford, UNLV, and Syracuse game, which is something they desperately need before November 5th when Clemson comes to town.
Once again, it goes back to what we talked about as the show opened, like how things have played out, regardless of the outcome. This month was going to yield the opportunity for Notre Dame to grow into the team that they eventually need to be. And, you talking about that, yes, they aren't even close to their potential as a team. But that's this coaching staff's job, right? Mm-hmm. Regardless of whether or not they're 2-2 or they could have been 3-1 or 4-0, their job in October was still going to be, we have to get this team even better to be able to do what they need to do at the end of this season and have a narrative of this team can play with anybody. This team is hot. Right. And it starts with BYU. You're spot on. The one thing that I like that I think a lot of people aren't talking about is that normally coming around this game, there will be a lot of buzz about Notre Dame and talking about how dangerous BYU is. Oh, Jaron Hall. And it's like the buzz is just a little bit mellow, even toned. And Notre Dame is just being allowed to come into the game and just play. Like,
who has more pressure on them in this game, Sean?
BYU has more pressure. Without question, BYU has more pressure because they know this is that game. They've already failed one test, which was Oregon. Right. They can't, if they get smashed by Oregon and Notre Dame, I don't care what they do the rest of the season. Like, they're going to be looked at as, oh, yeah, okay, you played well in your conference. You beat the other teams. But when you played decent Power 5 teams, you got crushed. That's it. It's the same BYU. So it's definitely more important for them. But we know how important this game is for Notre Dame.
Right.
They know how important this game is for them. And the task is still, look, we have 2 top 25 teams on our schedule in the month of October. Mm-hmm. Let's go handle our business. Because you can say what you want to say. You can talk about Marshall, but that's in the past. We're moving forward. We run October and get 2 wins against top 25 teams. We're not that team. You can say what you want to say. That loss, they'll talk about that loss for years to come.
Yep.
But in the present, if they do what they need to do, they won't be the same team. And they'll know that. So the growth, and I think Marcus Freeman, in my opinion, yesterday's press conference might have been one of the most impressive press conferences that Marcus Freeman has had.
He's starting to get a lot more comfortable engaging the media.
Yes. I think he was good. I think he was honest. And regardless of whether or not you agreed with some of the things he said, you had to say to yourself, you know what? He's consistent. He's consistent. He's not lying to us. This is the vision he has. And you know what? And I have to respect that. And that's what I get from him. He's starting to feel himself or fill out. It's almost like as a teenager, you hit a spurt as an athlete where you start to fill out and your shoulders get wider. I see him, his shoulders going back a little bit further. speaking with a little bit more confidence, understanding how to handle things, and being sure of what he wants to say instead of thinking about what he needs to say, and answering questions. So it's all coming together, and hopefully we get the outcomes that we think we should get with this Notre Dame team. Like if this Notre Dame team plays well, you mentioned it. If they play the same game they played against Marshall, they can lose. If they
Yes.
play the
If
same
they
way
play like they did against Cal. Yeah.
they can lose.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But if they come out like they did in the first half against North Carolina, they'll have a double-digit lead against BYU.
Yeah. Yep.
They will. So,
Sean, let's talk about what we're going to learn about Notre Dame from this game. And it's not necessarily a prediction of what we're going to learn, because it's going to learn one way or the other. That's kind of what we're talking about is, and where it comes from is BYU is a beatable team, but they're a team that can beat you, as we've both said. And what that means is there's things about this BYU team that present unique challenges to Notre Dame. Because as you said, football is a game of matchups. And that's why the transitive property never works, right, in football. Well, this team beat this team, and so that means this team's going to beat that team. It's not how it works, right? And so when you look at this particular matchup, there's things about BYU that set up well for parts of Notre Dame to continue thriving. There's other parts of BYU that could put a test on things that are perceived strengths of this Notre Dame team or the weaknesses of this Notre Dame football team. So when I look at BYU, I think the first thing that kind of comes to mind for me is we're going to learn a lot about this Notre Dame offense, and we'll talk a little bit big picture about it. But I think we're going to learn a lot about this Notre Dame offense from the standpoint of have they made strides? I think that's a big thing for me is has this Notre Dame offense grown? Or because here's the thing that's unknown. I'm taking nothing away from the performance that Notre Dame had against North Carolina. It was good to see. It was a good game plan. It was a well-called game. It was executed relatively well. Like, I like what Tommy Rees did. I'm in no way taking away from the job he did. Yes, North Carolina stinks, but it wasn't like Notre Dame just went out and, beat up a bad North Carolina team and just out-talented them and didn't have a good game plan. They just kind of ran it down their throat, which we've seen Notre Dame do in the past, where they just, they beat up an inferior opponent and you really don't learn a lot about them. And we learned some things about Notre Dame against North Carolina, but their defense is really bad. And we've only seen this offense look good for for a game and a half of the season. So I think what BYU does is, yes, their run defense is not great, but I think a lot of Notre Dame fans are assuming things about BYU that in the quality of the team that they are, that I don't think are accurate. And for me, for example, I don't think BYU's defense is as bad as a lot of Notre Dame fans think that it is. I think that it's not great by any stretch. It can be run on for sure, but they have a pretty good pass defense. And their pass defense isn't just good because they don't play teams that can throw the football. Their pass defense is good because they have a very experienced secondary, and they have good scheme that can confuse quarterbacks and create some incompletions. So just all around, and we'll get into some specifics of this as well, but for me, I think we're going to learn a lot about this offensive football team just in general. If they have truly turned the corner offensively, then this should be at least a 30-plus point game against BYU. And when you look at what BYU has done this year, they're giving up 26.4 points per game, which is a very low ranking. It ranks them 73rd in the country. They're 90th in yards, rushing yards allowed per game, and 62nd in yards allowed per rush attempt. But they're only 38th. But not only, they're 38th in total yards and total defense, and they're 29th in yards allowed per play. And you look at their pass game as a big reason why. They're 19th in passing yards allowed. They're 13th in yards allowed per attempt. They're 13th in yards per completion. So, they've done some good things in those areas that make this a unique challenge for Notre Dame. So, Sean, when I look at this, I look at it and say, when I see this football team, I say, is it a good defense Yeah, it's a good defense. Is it a great defense? No way. Is it a bad defense? No way. It's just a quality defense, like Marshall, like Cal, right? And those are good quality defenses, Cal being even better than Marshall. And you did okay, but like we were celebrating a 24-point outburst against Cal, right? Like, like that's not going to get it done against BYU most likely unless the defense really balls out, which they're capable of doing. But if you win this game 24-21, Sean, or 27-24, it tells me that this offense didn't really turn a corner. It's still the same team that struggled. They just beat up on a bad North Carolina. So I think that's something that we're going to see too, Sean, is we're going to learn a lot about this football team, this offensive football team, from the standpoint of, has the offense really turned the corner moving forward?
Yeah, and I think this offense is going to challenge Notre Dame in certain areas. The discipline is going to have to be at an all-time high this week. Like BYU isn't about to, they're not the type of passing offense that's just about to come out four wide and just, they're totally different than how they attack you, than what they saw with Phil Longo and Drake May and those wide receivers. Totally different. Different type of athletes, but their RPO game with Jaron Hall and being disciplined on the backside, taking away the bootleg, being able to get upfield and get pressure in his face. Those are the things that they want to do. They like to scheme a lot of their best guys open, especially from the slot. I saw multiple times where they run that fade from the slot with the two outside guys running hitches. They did it a lot against Oregon. They did it a lot against Utah State. And these are the things, just unique challenges that they're going to give the secondary, even though the secondary is, playing really good, as Marcus Freeman talked about, except for some of those big plays and from technique standpoints of not letting things happen. But even more than that, I don't think they're going to give, from a scheme standpoint, unless Notre Dame is able to get a big lead and force the hand of BYU. I think BYU is going to try and slow that pass rush of Notre Dame. Slow Isaiah Foskey down with, RPOs and quick passes and, misdirection, and then try to attack them that way. So it's going to be very interesting to see how BYU goes about using what they have that's a strength for them to attack what are perceived as the strengths of the Notre Dame defense thus far, being the secondary and that pass rush.
Yeah. Well, and you look at BYU, they're going to run jet sweeps. I mean, They set the tone for that first play of the season. I mean, they went on a 70-yard touchdown run on a jet sweep to Puka Nacua in the opener. And they do a lot of that. They do perimeter screens. They do some stuff that Notre Dame does. I mean, they'll motion the back out of the backfield and throw them a swing pass on a swing screen. They'll run crossers. They run a lot of perimeter stuff. The difference between BYU and North Carolina's wide receiving core is enormous. And here's what I mean by that. North Carolina has a really athletic group of receivers that aren't necessarily great route runners outside of Josh Downs, because the air raid doesn't focus as much on technique as it does scheme, right? BYU's polar opposite. They're not super athletic. Puka Nacua is a good athlete. Don't get me wrong, but the rest of the receiving core is not. Keanu Hill's a good athlete. I mean, they're quality athletes, but they're not like the North Carolina kids. But they're really well coached. They know how to get open. They know how to use their bodies. They know how to use leverage. They know how to do some things that have given the Notre Dame receiver some problems. And so that's what you kind of look at and say, like, they are going to test the strength of Notre Dame pass defense. The other thing I think we're going to learn too is the rush defense for Notre Dame, and then we'll circle back to the Notre Dame offense here in a little bit. But I think the thing too is BYU's rush offense has been really inconsistent this year, Sean. Like at times it looks really good, and at times it doesn't look good at all. I mean, in the Utah State was in a really interesting game, because if you look at the numbers, they did not run the ball well at all. 117 yards, 3.7 yards per carry. They were abysmal in the first half. But then they started the spark they got in the second half came from them doing different things. They did some substitutions. They put Miles Davis in. They established the run game, and that kind of sparked the run in the second half, which allowed them to kind of start to pull away. And then they went back to the pass, and then Utah State was prepared for that. But, other times they've looked good. They have 314 yards rushing against South Florida. They had 188 against Wyoming, but then they rushed for 61 against Oregon, 83 against Baylor, and averaged 2.5 yards per carry in both games. Notre Dame's rush defense has been sort of a tale of two teams. First two games, not good. Even though they held both Ohio State they held Ohio State like 60, I think, trying to find I wrote an article about this the other day, Sean, but what I did was I broke down kind of what other teams are averaging when they don't play Notre Dame, right? They held Ohio State to about 68 yards below what they've averaged against their other three opponents, even though they didn't stop Ohio State. They still gave up too many yards. They held Marshall to like 10 yards below their average. Marshall ran really well on Notre Dame. But then you look at Cal, they held them well below their season average in that game. And then North Carolina, they held them to 152 yards below their average against other teams. Cal was 44, held them to 44 below. But that's a little misleading because Cal had that one game against they ran for, was it Arizona? They ran for like 300 some yards. It kind of padded their stats. They're not a real good rushing team. So they were about where they were. But a lot of stuff against Cal was quarterback scrambles. And then same thing against North Carolina. So which rush defense shows up? Because here's the thing that I'll say. I'm a believer in this in most games, not always, but this is another example of BYU's not a great rushing team, Sean. You've got to be able to shut down that run game without committing resources to it and then make them a passing team, right? It's like with anything. Make them pass because they have to, not because they want to, right? And you've got to be able to shut down the run game. Now, here's what that can't mean. It can't mean shut down the run game because you put your safeties in the box and you're focused on shutting down the run game. No. Your line and your linebackers have to play well. You can't, because BYU is going to scheme stuff for you on the run game. They're going to do misdirections and stuff like that and show action one way and come back with a counter the other. They're going to run read zone, all that kind of stuff to try to trick you. They're going to, because they have a great O-line in pass pro. Their O-line is okay as run blockers. Right, I think Clark Barrington's a really good run blocker at left guard, but their other offensive linemen, like the left tackle, and I can't believe his name is escaping me right now because he's a big time player. We had him on our preseason all conference team, but for some reason his name is escaping me. I'm pulling him to depth. Blake Freeland. He's more of a pass blocker than he is a run blocker, in my opinion. He's not a real physical run blocker, but you've got to dominate at the point of attack with your front. And I think the thing that Notre Dame did a great job of against North Carolina, which shocked me, I didn't think they could do it. They shut down the North Carolina run game with their front four just by constantly resetting the line of scrimmage in their favor. And then that allowed the linebackers to run free. They didn't have to put if you go back and watch that game, the safeties did not make a lot of tackles in the run game. They were making tackles in the pass game. They were shutting down the run game with their box. If they can do that against BYU, I think that's a key to success. But what it requires, Sean, is a great performance from the D-line. You're correct. BYU is going to test that D-line. They may not get a ton of sacks because they're going to throw the ball quick. They will run some play action, and this is a good pass-blocking offensive line. But they've also given up 7 sacks in 5 games. Which isn't a lot, but they haven't played any defenses like Notre Dame's yet either. Yeah. And this is what we said about North Carolina. North Carolina, great on offense, we said, but they haven't played a defense like Notre Dame's. Well, the closest thing BYU played to a defense like Notre Dame's was against Baylor. And they struggled that game.
They struggled,
you know? Right. And so, when you look at that matchup, I mean, they scored 26 points, but they needed overtime. They needed overtime to get to those 26 points. Even with overtime, they only had 366 yards of offense. Now, they were able to throw the ball effectively in that game, but it wasn't great. They gave up a couple sacks to Baylor. I mean, so you look at it and say, that's the closest thing they've seen. And then the next closest defense the one Notre Dame has is Oregon's, and they gave up 21 points. Well, Oregon doesn't have a great defense. This is a defense that gave up 41 points to Washington State and 49 points to Georgia, right? So they held them to 21. So if your D-line is as good as we think it is, then they should dominate. And that's the thing we're going to learn, Sean, too, is what we saw the last 2 games from the defensive line, who they are, because it's much like the offensive side of the ball. Cal's offensive line is awful. North Carolina's offensive line is really passive and not really good. They dominated those two. This is the best offensive line you will have faced since Ohio State. It's better than Marshall's, and you struggled against Marshall's offensive line. So that's another thing, too, about this defense, Sean, is we're going to learn a lot about this defensive line because this is going to be a tall, long, quality offensive line. It's not great, but it's a quality offensive line that has two really good players on the left side. Their left side of their line is really good. So that's another thing we're going to learn about this football team is the defensive line as good as it needs to be and as good as it was the last 2 weeks, or did they just beat up on bad offensive lines?
Yeah, one of the things I will like to point out, though, in that game, Utah State, and I didn't know this, Blake Anderson, shout out to him and the job he's done in the last year and 5 games with this team, because I didn't know that they led the nation in tackles for losses last year until I was watching that game. And then they had 11 tackles for losses against BYU. So what that means is, yes, BYU's offensive line is good and pass pro, but they struggle with movements. They struggle with stunts because Utah State was a much smaller defensive line, but they were quick and they did a lot of stand up, and you didn't know where they were coming from. You didn't know who was coming. They would give you 6-man front, bring 4, then bring 5. BYU struggled with that for about 2.5 quarters. And then, like you said, they went back to more of a downhill rushing attack because they really were trying to run to the outside with their RPOs and their play actions. And, you know, they're big, they're good, but they're kind of stiff and not really athletic. So when they pull, you can kind of destroy that if you use your quickness to get upfield and get up under them. Utah State did that well for about 2.5 quarters. And then BYU said, you know what, just line up and go straight at them. They're smaller than us. Let's push them around. That set up the play action. They got out in front. Utah State had a freshman quarterback starting his first game, so they had to keep things close, and they weren't able to do it. But I agree totally with you. It's going to be a challenge, but for me, it's all about discipline. And I said this last week. I said more than likely Drake May and North Carolina are going to go right down the field in that first series. They're going to be able to script, and they're going to score. And I said that's fine. I want to see how Al Golden and Notre Dame then adjust. Because once North Carolina is off their script and you have to play football now, now let's see what they do. And that's when Notre Dame started to take over the game. I wouldn't be surprised if BYU had a script. They were able to execute, and they went down and scored early on the first drive. It wouldn't shock me at all. How does Notre Dame react to that? Do they start taking things away? Do they force them into being a one-dimensional team and put a lot on the shoulders of Jaren Hall and those wide receivers to be perfect? Because you talked about them not being as athletic as the Carolina receivers that can just get out behind you because of their speed and athleticism. Sometimes you have to scheme them open, and that can become really frustrating, because if you're just not good enough to beat guys and make plays, and Notre Dame continues to tighten things down on the run game and make you one-dimensional, it can become very frustrating for a guy like Jaren Hall. That's what Oregon did. That's what Baylor did. And Baylor just didn't have the offense to really take control and take advantage of the opportunities they had. But I'm looking forward to this, man, because I think, once again, as you said before, this really isn't week to week because Al Golden will have more than 1 week to prepare for BYU. Yeah. So I expect him to come into this matchup with a really good game plan, and they get, they're getting one of their best blitzers back in Ramon Henderson. He's better. Marcus Freeman talked about DJ Brown being banged up and being healthy now, fully healthy, and everybody feeling better. So I expect that defensive line for Notre Dame to be very spry, very excited, and very eager to first stop that run game and then get after Jaren Hall and that passing game for BYU.
I think the thing that surprised me about North Carolina, Sean, is they didn't do as much of the stuff that messes with your eye discipline. We talk about that a lot on our show. They didn't do like a lot of the reverses and the jets and the things and the screens. And I think they almost kind of played a little bit scared of Notre Dame's speed on defense, to be honest with you. And I think they tried to use their size to attack down the field, and that worked a couple times, but not a lot. I thought they could run, and they were a little surprised they couldn't. I mean, they tried to come out running on Notre Dame early. BYU won't make that mistake. BYU is going to run jets. They're going to run, like stuff we talked about. They are a very difficult offense to prepare for because they do so much stuff that makes you go left and right. And then that opens up some opportunities over the middle and some opportunities down the field. They're going to do they're going to pump fake on a bubble screen and throw deep. You've got to be disciplined for that. There's going to be play action shots that they're going to take down the field. You got to be prepared for that. Yeah. They really make you mentioned at the very beginning of your discussion about this, they really make it to where you have to be disciplined because they are a 70-yard play waiting to happen, not because they have elite athletes, because they scheme well.
Yeah.
And that's the key is they'll create some of those big play opportunities. And so you have to be disciplined, and it all goes back to the defensive line. Those big play opportunities are harder to get to when your defensive line's getting a pass rush. That's going to be a key.
Yeah.
I want to circle back to the offense, Sean, because this was the part that I was discussing when you had to step out. We were having some audio issues, but we've got those resolved now. This is the thing that I mentioned is we still have no clue what this offense is. And we're going to have a mailbag after this. And there's a lot of talk about Tobias Merriweather in there, and we'll have plenty to say on that, I promise you. But we're still talking about an offensive football team that prior to the North Carolina game hadn't scored more than 24 points in a game. And North Carolina is really bad on defense. This is the game that's going to tell us, has Notre Dame turned the corner on offense? They don't need to score 40 on BYU. They do great. I mean, it's not just about that. It's also about, look, can you go out and be balanced, right? I think they can run on them, but can you throw on them? Because as I mentioned before, this is a really good pass defense. It is. It's not great. It's not elite, but again, like they're very complex. They do a lot of things to mess with your quarterback's reads. They're going to show them one thing, roll to something different, show different looks. I mean, they'll do things, Sean, and it's wild. They run like they're a 4-down team they're a 3-down team out of 4-down personnel.
Let me ask you a question before you get deep into this.
Mm-hmm.
I was confused watching their defense. Because I'm like, wait a minute, are they in nickel?
Yeah.
Are they in down? Like, what is going on? Like you said, I see 4 down, but I'm like, wait a minute.
Yeah.
I see their 2 linebackers, but so I'm glad you're going into this because you're about to educate me because I couldn't figure it out.
Yeah. Right. So they're a 3-down team out of 4-down personnel. Okay. Now, last week against Utah State, they did not have Tyler Batty, who's their best defensive lineman. He was hurt. He'll be back for this game. But like they'll line him up as a viper. But the difference is they will line up in a lot of odd fronts out of that and just kind of have him as almost like a 3-4 linebacker. They'll be in a 3 linebacker defense, but then they will vacate the linebackers out of the box and have like a 4-down and their mic daring you to run the ball, and then they just collapse on it from outside and inside. I think that's partly why they're vulnerable against the run, because they think they can just fold back inside and funnel everything back inside. But the reality is they're not a super athletic front 4, and you can kind of move them. And I think that's why they're getting gashed. And that's, Sean, why they have issues when you kind of run some of that perimeter stuff, because when you're trying to fill from here and here, some holes are going to open up. It makes it a lot harder to fit because you're now fitting from distance.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of those things that's kind of created an issue for them. So, you know, when I look at it, Sean, it's a complex defense that they're going to try to bait you into things that you don't want to do. They're going to show you looks trying to get you to do something that you don't necessarily want to do, in hopes of, like, they're going to show one thing with their alignment and their call is going to play to what they think they can bait you to do. It's a very strange defense. They listed 15 different positions on their 2 deep, which just tells you some of the weird complexity. Like they have like 5 different defensive line starting spots, like 3 different linebacker spots, like 5 different. It was just crazy how their 2 deep was. And they'll show you a lot of different personnel, but they'll also line up in a lot of different ways out of each personnel grouping, which can make it challenging to play for. I also think what it does, however, is it can create confusion on their part. This is a team that is prone to giving up big plays. This is a team that's prone to, oops, I thought I was supposed to do this and I didn't do it, and now there's a guy running down the seam wide open. Or a guy's one-on-one when he was supposed to be left one-on-one. So that is one of the drawbacks to it, but they're a pretty veteran team, and they don't make a lot of those mistakes. You kind of have to outplay them. But I think the weird alignment kind of plays into what Notre Dame wants to do offensively, right? They want to run the football. They want to try to get you in space. They want to attack vertically with their pass game. And I think BYU can be vulnerable to that if you can protect the quarterback. This is not a team that forces a lot of turnovers. They've had 5 in 5 games, and this is a team that doesn't have a lot of sacks. So I think those are areas where Notre Dame should be able to have success. The problem is, can Notre Dame – they have 9 sacks in 5 games, less than 2 a game. They've only forced 1 turnover per game, which is better than Notre Dame's rate so far. So I think those are the things that present the challenge, right? And the other thing too is because they know their offense is good. So they're willing to take some chances knowing that their offense can get points back. And so what you have to do offensively is you have to take some big opportunities, because if you can get early success against them and your defense can make some stops and then they become one-dimensional because they're playing from behind, that's when they get in trouble. It's exactly what happened against Oregon, right? They got behind early. The run game was non-existent, and Oregon just out-athleted them on the perimeter, and they had no answers, right? And Oregon was playing without one of their better defensive linemen in that game too. So Notre Dame, it's a different scheme, but it's the same recipe, right? Shut down the run game with the box and then out-athlete them on the perimeter. If you can do that, that's how you shut this offense down. Baylor was able to do that. Oregon was able to do that. Can Notre Dame do that? That's the question, because they should have done that against Marshall, and they didn't. Right. And so that's kind of what we're going to learn about this group. So I think offensively, you've got to come out early, Sean, and have success and allow your defense to play with a lead. If they can play, like we talked about North Carolina being a great come from behind team, I don't think BYU is.
No,
I don't.
No,
I don't. So I think that's an important. But is this offense capable of that? We don't know the answer to that. One good game against one of the worst defenses at the Power 5 level is not your we've arrived moment. That doesn't take anything away from Tommy Rees's game plan. It was excellent against North Carolina. It doesn't take anything away from his play calling. And some of the plays he called in that game were just like, dude, this is the Tommy Rees we were wanting to see the first 3 games, right? Like, where was this against Ohio State? Where was the counter throwback against Ohio State? Where was the bootleg with the second running back running a wheel route? Where was all that stuff against Ohio State, right? Where was that creativity against Marshall? We didn't see it. So it doesn't erase the first 2 and 3 games, but it also, it also shouldn't be dismissed because he did a great job. Yeah. If he can replicate that against BYU while also making some personnel changes, which we'll discuss in the mailbag, then I think that's how we know this offense has turned a corner. Beating up on a crap defense like North Carolina, and there's no other way to describe it. That's a horrible defense. But did you see him against Virginia Tech? They looked a little better.
They looked a lot better.
Right? Yeah. Now, what helps is that Virginia Tech's offense is terrible. They're averaging 18.2 points per game. They scored 10 against West Virginia and 17 against Old Dominion, right? They're not very good, but they held them to 10 points, Sean. I mean, you can't take away from that. I mean, so, they played better. They definitely played better. So was it just that Notre Dame is that good? Did North Carolina just have a bad day? No, because they've had bad days all up until then. Yeah. Was it that after playing Notre Dame, Virginia Tech looked like a JV squad? Maybe. Maybe. Yeah. But the point is they're going to need this game for me to believe that they've turned the corner. Success in this game is going to be the key. And so it goes back to the original theme of we're going to learn a lot about this football team. And I think we're going to learn that unit offensively is the unit we're going to learn the most about in this game, Sean. And if that unit plays well against this defense, which is well coached, it's an okay defense. It's not great, but it's not bad either. Then it tells me, okay, they've turned a corner, and you start feeling really good about this team's ability to go on a run, because their ability to go on a run to the point where they can play with and beat Clemson, play with and beat USC is going to be dependent on their offense figuring it out. It just flat out is. And if they can do it in this game, then I'm going to start saying, okay. Because if they beat up on Stanford, it's no different than beating up on North Carolina to me. If they beat up on UNLV, it's like, guys, they have 0 NFL players, and you have NFL players across the board. You know what I mean? Like, same with Syracuse. Syracuse is a good football team. It's still Syracuse, right? Yeah. I mean, this is still a team that barely beat Virginia, who stinks, barely beat Purdue, who's okay, although they looked really good against Minnesota on Saturday. But it's like, those are games you should win. If you can move the ball on this team, then that says, okay, they've turned a corner, Sean. There's no doubt.
You're right. And it's nothing left to really do other than to see if they can do it.
Yep.
Like the talk is out of the building. You had a great
Yep.
question when you talked about the extra week of evaluation that the coaching staff has had, and does that play into, not only development and getting guys on the field, but how you attack moving forward. And because you point to it, and I never really thought about it. Like that time going from Saturday, Sunday, and then to Thursday, you basically have to have installed pretty much on Wednesday of that week preparing for the game, and then you practice Thursday, and then Friday's pretty much walk through if you have anything else, and then you play. And that's the challenge for this coaching staff. And BYU gave themselves, by playing on Thursday night, they gave themselves a little bit extra time to prepare and get some of their guys back healthy. So it's going to be an interesting matchup. It's going to be a little bit of chess, I would say, more so for BYU, because at some point, I really believe that physically, the coaching staff and the players of Notre Dame walk onto that field knowing and feeling, dude, we're better than them. We're a better team than BYU. So we can line up. Let's line up and just physically take this game over.
Let's pull up a question, Sean, to speak to that. David Lowe says the way Brian feels about Syracuse, UNLV, and Stanford is the same way I feel about BYU. I think it's a game Notre Dame is supposed to win. I think you're missing the point, David. And it's the point Sean's saying. BYU is a game Notre Dame should win. They're supposed to win that. Our point is, but we don't – if they beat BYU, then it tells us this is the team that we thought we're going to see. We just saw it 3 weeks too late, later than we thought, right?
Yeah.
And then you roll Stanford, you roll OV, and you roll Syracuse. But you're assuming that, like what we're saying, we're not going to assume that the team we saw against North Carolina for 3 quarters is the team we're going to get here, because this is still the same team that struggled to score on Cal for half the game and struggled to, lost to Marshall. This team lost to Marshall less than a month ago. Right. So to just assume they're going to go on a neutral field and beat BYU, it's like Notre Dame fans have convinced themselves that BYU is just like terrible football team for some reason, because they watched a half against Utah State where their best defensive lineman didn't play. Right. Like this is a good football team. Right. This is a football team that went 6-1 against Power 5 teams last year. This is a football team that beat Baylor in overtime. Baylor just went toe-to-toe with Oklahoma State for a full game. Baylor just smacked Iowa State the week before that. Baylor's a quality football team. And BYU beat them. They had a bad game against Oregon. One bad game doesn't define you because, they got blown out by Oregon. Oregon got blown out by Georgia. Is the team we've seen of Oregon the last 4 weeks the same team that got blown out? No, they're not. The point we're making is, yes, Notre Dame should win this game. Mm-hmm. But what do you want us to do? Show, hey, guys, Notre Dame should win this game. Hey, have a great week. We'll see you in the postgame show on Saturday. Right? There's a lot to learn about this football team. And they have not shown themselves to be a team that lets us say, this is who they are. I think we have a pretty good idea of who the defense is for the most part. But as a team, we still don't know who this team is. And that's the point of this game. And my comment was simply, if they beat BYU the way that we think they should, then they should go out and roll the next 3 opponents. If they lose to BYU, then I'm not just automatically throwing out Stanford as a win or Syracuse as a win. Because they're not. Because Syracuse is a team Notre Dame should beat convincingly. But so is Marshall. That's the point. Yeah. And that's what Sean and I are talking about as far as what the opportunity here is for Notre Dame.
And let's say this as well. Stop saying that if they beat the 4 teams on their schedule, that it really doesn't matter. It does. Mm-hmm. Every game matters. Every game is going to tell you something about this team. It matters. Because the season really is not about the schedule anymore. It's about Notre Dame.
Right.
And how they get better and how they progress. Right. That means each test, regardless of if you view BYU and Syracuse as quizzes rather than tests, and you view Clemson as the midterm and USC as the final exam, then fine. Right. However you want to determine that, that's fine. But it still tells you something, and it still goes down in the final grade book.
Yep.
To give you the final grade at the end of the season. So it all matters. It all averages out. All of these games matter. And all of these games are going to tell a story about who Notre Dame is at that point in the season. That's why you stay connected. That's why you're intrigued about where Notre Dame is and how they're going to continue week to week moving forward. It's because you're going to find something out about your team.
Right. Exactly. And Salty says this, and this is Salty gets it, Sean. I think he understands where we're coming from. He says, I've lost any thoughts of being supposed to win against anyone. We're not far enough away from Marshall, like gas station sushi. It can resurface at any time. Ooh. I mean, that's kind of our point about the very premise of this show was an opportunity for Notre Dame. This is an opportunity game for Notre Dame. This is a game where Notre Dame can show that they are that team, Sean, to your point. It's not about if Notre Dame plays their game, I don't care what BYU does, Notre Dame will win.
They'll win.
Right. But the same thing was true against Ohio State, in my opinion. Mm-hmm. The same thing is true against Marshall. The same thing is true against Cal from a standpoint of that should not have been a 7-point game.
No.
Right. And so, I mean, Cal just lost by like 19 to Washington State. Right. And the same thing is true against North Carolina. That game should have been 63-17. If we're going to sit there and say if Notre Dame has arrived as a football team, they eliminate 2 of the big plays. North Carolina scores 17. Maybe they get a garbage point touchdown to get to 24 late. Yeah. But Notre Dame's in the 50s or 60s.
Yeah.
Because they left a lot of points on the board, right? They are not that team yet. And that's the point. Now, the bye week, I think, normally I like buys later in the year. For this Notre Dame team, I think the bye came at a perfect time.
Perfect time. I totally
because
agree.
Now they can sit back and say, we've got a new quarterback. We've got to readjust our offense, and they need to readjust the offense. We've got to clean up some things. We've got some guys banged up. Let's get everybody healthy mentally, physically, and all that, and then figure out who we're going to be. And that's the point of this show is that's what this – and we're going to get into BYU and the matchups and some of the more specific X's and O's stuff that we do. But it was important to lay the foundation of how big this game is for Notre Dame. And I think this is what a lot of Notre Dame fans are missing about this game, Sean. I'm seeing people on the board like, oh, Notre Dame should win 49-17. And I'm like, you're setting yourself up to be pissed if they don't win by 5 touchdowns, right? Like I think some people just like being upset, and so they do that. Yeah. But that doesn't mean Notre Dame's not capable of doing that. And so to me, I think dismissing BYU for whatever reason, because we're seeing people in the chat like, BYU's this bum football team. If you think that about BYU, I'm sorry, you're misguided, right? And if you look at this football team, they're 25-5 in the last 3 years. 25-5. They went 6-1 against Power 5 teams last year. They're 8-2 against Power 5 teams the last 2 years combined. Right? I mean, that's pretty good.
It's a good program.
This is a quality football team. Is it one Notre Dame should handle? Yes, it is. We're not denying that. We're not saying if Notre Dame goes out there and wins 24-21, we're excited. No, we said we're accept that because at this point in time, you just take a win. But we said on the show, if that's the win they get, that tells me they haven't turned a corner. Right? It tells me, Sean, all that tells me is they just have better players than BYU, which they do. And so our point is what we're going to learn about this football team is if you can handle your business, because if Notre Dame, here's the thing, Sean, let's say Notre Dame wins 42-17. If you've convinced yourself that BYU stinks, then you're not going to appreciate the quality of that kind of win. And that's the point. That's going to require Notre Dame to play really good football. Are they capable of it? Yeah. Yeah. But we can't assume it's going to happen because this, like as Salty said, this is still a team that less than a month ago lost to Marshall, Sean.
Yeah.
I mean, so that's what I'm excited about. And here's another thing that we didn't mention as well. Notre Dame has really struggled with top mobile quarterbacks. Jaron Hall is one of the best that they're going to play this year. And they play a lot of really good quarterbacks this year. He's not a runner per se, but he can run. But he's a guy that can do a lot of things that we saw C.J. Stroud hurt Notre Dame with in the first game, which is avoid the pass rush, climb the pocket, get outside, make plays outside of the script of the offense. If they can slow that down, that's another example of this team is taking the steps to getting to where they can be. And those are the things that would make me feel like you can then go roll the next few teams that you play. Yeah. But we got to see it this week first. That's the key to this whole thing.
And it goes back to the discipline that we have to play with. Notre Dame has to play with on defense. because you don't want to just come off the edges. You kind of want to have a very patient, slow pass rush against this guy, right? Because they're going to try to get the ball out of their hands, right? So to combat that, there's no sense of trying to fly up the field. Make him come off of his first read. Make him hold the ball a second longer, 2 seconds longer.
Right.
And then when he has to pull his eyes down and try to move up in the pocket, sometimes you might have Maris there spying, like they did against Drake May. That was one of the things they adjusted to late in the first quarter. And then sometimes your tackles might not get as deep and might be conscious of, okay, when he steps up, this is where we're going to close the pocket in rather than just, giving him an alley to come up through. There are a lot of different things that they're going to have to be disciplined to make sure, and he'll pull it on the RPO as well. So you have to be very aware of that as well. It's a lot of different things. Eye discipline is something we hear all the time, specifically from a defensive standpoint. And Notre Dame is going to have to show that they can be disciplined to be able to. I think there's a saying that kind of connects to this, but the best way I can say it, and maybe you can remember it, they're going to have to be disciplined to get the opportunity to go hunt.
Yeah.
They're going to have to be disciplined early to set up the opportunities where they're out in front and now they can go hunt Jaren Hall.
Right.
Because the running game is out the window. Now they can go get him. And hopefully, whether it's late second quarter or third quarter, they put themselves in that position where they can go hunt and start making life a little bit more miserable for Jaren Hall, who, in my opinion, I didn't know his arm was that good.
Yeah.
Until I watched him last week against Utah State. I'm like, oh man, he has a pretty good arm. Man, he's accurate. Like, yeah, you're gonna have to, even if you don't sack him, you're gonna have to get some tackles for losses, you're gonna have to get some pressures, and then you're gonna have to make them one-dimensional. And that's the task at hand.
Shashawn, I think that kind of wraps up the first look at this matchup and just kind of big picture what they are. As we get into the week, we'll dive more into specifics about this matchup. We'll talk a little bit more about what they do offensively and defensively. We'll get into specific, the statistical areas that they are good and the statistical areas where maybe they're not as good, where they're more vulnerable. I think Notre Dame there are some things about Notre Dame that present them with opportunities in this game, and there are some things where Notre Dame is going to have to guard against areas where BYU's good and Notre Dame hasn't been as good. So that'll be an interesting part of the matchup. We're going to go mailbag next, Sean, but before we do, I want to ask everybody to hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, hit the notification bell, and share this podcast. If you are listening via podcast form, we would also appreciate you giving us a 5-star review. The guys at CFB All-America Podcast, which is part of the CFB Nation channel, have also released their show today, talking about coaches being fired, Alabama leaping Georgia, the Pac-12, their resurgence, Sean, which I think is a very interesting topic I'd like to discuss with you later after the show, because I'm still not sold on the Pac-12 resurgence. We shall see. But, a lot of good stuff on there. So subscribe to that as well. And, of course, always join us on the Irish Breakdown message board.